This is Rat Alert. Civil defense information will be broadcast at 6:40.
West of the Rockies, you're on the air. Hello.
Y2K, how can we prepare?
Stop a few of their machines and radios. Throw them into darkness for a few hours.
We are fighting for our lives. My family must survive.
For 5 years, 1,000 gallons of gas, air filtration, water filtration.
Coming at you from the frozen tundra that is East Central Alberta, Canada, streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Rumble, and ODYSEE. Welcome back to the workshop where we create community, find freedom, promote preparedness, and share success. I am Toolman Tim. Today is August the 1st, 2023, and this is episode 347 of Workshop Radio. How is everyone out there? In just a minute, we're going to get to the incredible conversation I just finished up with James Wesley Rawles. You'll probably know him as the author of Patriots, but he is also an incredible wealth of knowledge in the history in the early days of the internet, preparedness, and survivalist movement. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. Real quick, 2 quick announcements. Number 1, if you want to support what I do and you like to get cool, embroidered Velcro morale patches every single month, sign up to the Patch of the Month Club at patchofthemonth.co. Last month's was 0 to 5 stars. Government would not recommend. Everybody loved that. And this month's I'm not giving away yet, but people who have got it so far enjoy it. $10 a month, $100 a year, patchofthemonth.co. Secondly, if you want to know more about the workshop community and you want to become part of our community where you can share your resources, share your knowledge, answer questions, and get your questions answered, come by and join the Telegram group. The link for that is in the description below. And guys, with that, let's get into the conversation I just finished up with Mr. James Wesley Rawles. I hope you guys enjoy it. It was just a breeze of an hour, and I would gladly have him back again. So with that, let's dive in. I did a little digging on you. Always love to know a little bit about the background. I mean, I've read your books before, but I read that you grew up surrounded around ranchers and physicists with a bunch of bomb shelters around. What was that like, and what was your upbringing a bit like?
Well, it was an interesting upbringing. That was in Livermore, California, the home of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. That's where my dad worked, and he was in experimental physics, particle physics, and worked with linear accelerators and cyclotrons.
Wow.
And was more in basic research than designing nuclear weapons. But, of course, the damage studies that they did played directly into creating nuclear weapons components. So indirectly, he was involved in nuclear weapons development. So it was an interesting place to grow up. It was a bunch of ranchers' kids and a bunch of physicists' kids, and it was a very stimulating environment for a young man. And growing up kind of in the shadow of the nuclear bomb, as it were, it certainly gave me an appreciation for the fragility of our society and for the threat of nuclear war.
Is that kind of where did your passion, I mean, growing up around nuclear bombs or nuclear shelters and that sort of thing, it must have kind of made you at least aware of what was going on, but where did your passion to kind of throw your entire life into preparedness come from?
Well, I think actually it dates farther back than that. It dates back to my pioneer family. My family came out west by covered wagon in the 1850s, and that pioneer mentality never really wore off in our family. We've always hunted, fished, been very keyed into the outdoors. And one of my parents, both of them, grew up in the Great Depression. Mm. And that mentality really never wore off on them. They were always very frugal. My mom wasn't into home canning that much, but definitely into home cooking for just about everything. We didn't do any kind of packaged foods. So all in all, I think my upbringing kind of steered me toward survivalism, and it was kind of a natural that I ended up writing the things that I did.
So who did you did you dig into Mel Stevens or Don or Mel Stevens or anybody like that? Like who were kind of the influential people?
It was more Mel Tappan
Yep.
and Jeff Cooper and folks like that really motivated me. That and of course Crescent Kearney. He was with another national laboratory. He was with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and he's the one that co-produced or co-authored the book Nuclear War Survival Skills.
Oh, okay. Have you ever met? Did you ever have the opportunity to meet him or no?
No, actually, the only really prominent prepper that I've ever had a chance to meet is a science fiction writer by the name of Dean Ing. He's from southwestern Oregon. He was a friend of Mel Tappan's, and he wrote a number of books with survival themes. One was called Pulling Through, which was a nuclear war survival novel. So I was more indirectly inspired rather than directly inspired by those survivalist writers.
Sure. I love digging into them. I've been kind of doing my best to pick up a few, like Kurt Saxon. He had the Survivor newsletter that got, so there's compendiums of them that were released, I think in maybe the early 80s. Yeah. Have you seen those?
Yeah. Oh, have I seen? I have the whole
story. Yeah. Oh, dude, good for you.
One of my influences, although, he was a racist, and I can never abide by that. But other than that, I thought that he was a very interesting, very creative guy. And he dug into 19th century technology. He liked going through the old formularies from the 1800s about do-it-yourself recipes for chemistry and for making your own soap and making your own medicines and that kind of thing. And that definitely inspired me as well.
It's interesting. It's tough because are you a believer in being able to separate a person's teachings from some of their other teaching? Like you mentioned about Kurt Saxon having kind of, how they love to use the word problematic nowadays, of course. But
I would never have associated with him socially.
Sure.
But I certainly benefited from factual stuff that he put out. I just kind of ignored his writings that were racist or quasi-racist. I think you can divide that. Anyone who has discernment can kind of pick and choose. There are so many people in the world that have good things to offer, but that also have aspects of their personal lives or philosophies or even religions that are just way out there and that I would never have anything to do with. So it's just a matter of having that level of discernment. And I would just warn all your listeners, be perceptive about people. Look at not just what they say, not even just what they do, but the long-term effects of what they do. And if you look at people from that perspective, like when you're evaluating whether you're evaluating a movie star or a politician or your local mayor, it really pays to be discerning of people. That's one thing I picked up in the intelligence community, is to never take anything at face value or anything that anyone says at face value. You really have to look at the long-term effects and also look at allegiances and alliances.
So I'm going to jump around just a little bit because your thoughts there really kind of. So, okay, I've for about a year now, I've been digging into the history of modern preparedness. I was laying in bed one night and I started doing some searching on the old Usenet groups, and I realized how new of a term prepper actually was.
Yeah.
Now, I went through, this is going to sound funny, but I went through a very short existential crisis for just a little bit because I saw all these people worried about all these things. that either never came to fruition or they were still worrying about. And just for a short period of time, I kind of questioned why exactly am I prepping or being in the preparedness mindset? And how do you look at, because you talk about the long-term thoughts or the long-term fruits of a person's labor. How do you look at that and keep prepping? Do you know what I mean?
Well, it can be discouraging sometimes, but there's also some very confirming events that come along, like Hurricane Katrina, for example, or the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
All the preps that I made really paid off with that pandemic. Obviously I didn't need to break out my dosimeter and rate meter.
Sure.
All my food storage, all the cleaning supplies, all the do-it-yourself stuff that we had squared away allowed us to basically hunker down and lock our gate. So even if the COVID pandemic had been as bad as it was originally advertised, where they said it might have a 20% lethality rate, that's what we were originally told.
Yes.
If it had been that bad, we could have simply locked our gate and stayed home for 3 years or longer, possibly. But we have enough storage food here at our ranch for 3 years without even anything from our garden or any livestock or any fish from our river. So it's gratifying to see that there are some confirming events, but it's discouraging sometimes to see that some of my preps have been around so long since I've been at this for more than 40 years. I literally had to feed to our livestock. No longer fit for human consumption. So, but beyond that, I think overall, I feel fully justified or perhaps vindicated in being a prepper or survivalist. I kind of use those terms interchangeably because a lot of what we've done has simply saved us money. By buying food in bulk, we've saved a tremendous amount of money over the years. If you buy rice in a 1 pound package, you're paying literally 10 times as much as you pay buying it in a 50 pound sack. So those kind of cost savings really add up in the long run.
Thank you, Jim. That's the answer I was looking for, because that's what I that was the understanding after a few days of thinking about it. It really does make a person's life better, whether something really bad happens or doesn't, because like you said, you were set for
right. It goes beyond tangible or monetary gain. It's also the lifestyle gain. I decided early on that I wasn't going to pursue the management track as a technical writer because I knew I wanted to work from home, and I wasn't going to pursue being an Army officer long term to round out my 20 years to retirement, because I resigned my commission just 7 years in as a captain. I didn't end up getting deployed for either the Gulf War or for the umpteen deployments that I would have had if I stayed in through the global war on terror. So there's an intangible there. The other tremendous intangible is the fact that by moving to the country, I was able to raise my kids, homeschool them, give them fresh water, tremendously nutritious food that we grew ourselves from our gardens, and raised our own livestock so we knew exactly what was in that meat. So there's an advantage there. I'm very proud of the way that my kids grew up, and they all were raised quite solid, as my grandfather would have said. And I'm very proud of them. And I think my choice of where I raised them and how much time I was able to spend with them since I was self-employed really shows.
Absolutely. I'm a big proponent of, in my pillars of preparedness, entrepreneurship is one of them. So I love hearing that. But so I know this is something you spoke of your ranch, and I know you're private about its location, but I did notice where you listed your location as Galt's Gulch. Do you feel like you found your own personal Galt's Gulch?
Yeah, to an extent. All of our neighbors are very like-minded, and I could literally, as I said before, lock the gate and live very self-sufficiently for an extended period of time. After maybe 10 years, we might run out of salt or something, or kerosene, but essentially we could live truly off-grid for a very long period of time. So that's something that I can point to as a plus. And in terms of a gulching kind of culture, where I live in the American Redoubt, pretty much everyone around me lives self-sufficiently or fairly self-sufficiently. Everybody has a garden. Everybody cuts their own firewood. Almost everybody hunts. Nearly everybody has a big gun collection. Almost everybody fishes for trout or landlocked salmon, kokanee, and almost everybody picks huckleberries every summer and service berries. So it's a fairly self-sufficient, self-reliant kind of community, and the whole attitude that goes along with that matches. Everybody is very much into barter and charity. It doesn't matter if you don't make a lot of money. Everybody gets along very well, whether you make $20,000 a year or $200,000 a year. We're all just neighbors. We know we all have to depend on each other because we live in a very remote area. If somebody needs, to pick up a prescription in town or go shopping for somebody who's ill, we don't hesitate at all. We're always looking out for our neighbors. And the same goes, wintertime when people need to get plowed out, or if somebody slides into a ditch and needs to get towed out, or, barn raising kind of activities, we all pitch in.
Nice. I just did a show recently on, I don't know if you follow it much, but over in South Africa, the really bad power outage crisis they've been having.
In there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just kind of became aware of it in the last few months. And as I was prepping the show, all I could think about was the how much it compares to what Ayn Rand had to say, or kind of what her vision of collapse was. Do you see any parallels between what she had to write when she wrote it and kind of what we're living through today?
Sure. Certainly, we're living in the age of big government, intrusive government. I like to call the modern era the age of deception and betrayal. That's what we're really living through. 30 years ago, I was warning about a slow slide scenario. And around us, that's exactly what we're living through, at least in the big cities where they have, rampant crime, drug use, homelessness. Yeah, just to see the homeless tent encampments that stretch on for block after block after block in so many cities, it really does look something out of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Absolutely. I was so excited when I saw that listing. I was like, I can ask him about Rand a little bit, because there's only so many people you interview that are at least somewhat well versed in her stuff. So thank you. So, all right, I brought you on because I have a couple of kind of passions or interests, and one, of course, is the history of modern preparedness. I'm doing my best to trace it from the civil defense era to modern preparedness, and for some reason I'm also a geek when it comes to vintage technology. That's one of my things, and I'm not really sure why, but it is. And I came across a throwaway line, I think it was even on Wikipedia, talking about the early BBSs and Usenet groups for prepping. And so I wanted to pick your brain, because I've been trying to find someone who at least has some experience with them. So do you remember, what are kind of your earliest memories? Yeah.
I didn't use bulletin board systems, BBSs, but I was quite active with Usenet. First in the late 1980s, when I was with DASIX Corporation, which is the spin-off of the earlier Daisy Cadnetics Corporation.
Okay.
He had access to what was called FidoNet. And FidoNet was a way to log into Usenet. And Usenet had a whole bunch of different groups. They're kind of analogous to the user forums that they have on websites now. They're all thread driven. They're all some are moderated, some are not. So it's very much like a modern forum. But it was in Usenet that we created terms like Kiatwaki that hadn't existed before, or get out of Dodge, which is one that I helped popularize. And in fact, I was, it had already been used as a phrase. I think I was the one who, at the suggestion of a buddy of mine, turned it into an acronym, GOOD, get out of Dodge. But those terms really didn't exist before Usenet. And most of those cropped up in Usenet in the 1980s. I was a lurker of Usenet in the late 80s. And then I was a poster to Usenet in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And there, I was mainly involved in a few forums. One was rec.guns, that's rec.guns, rec.guns. Another was talk.politics.guns. And the main one was one called mis.survivalism, which was miscellaneous, MISC.survivalism. And it was there that a lot of these, the whole bug out bag culture kind of developed, the whole modern stance on preparedness. It was kind of an outgrowth of Don Stevens and Mel Tappan and all those folks kind of crystallized down. And then it was given kind of a high-tech spin, especially in the late 1990s, with the worries about Y2K.
Yes.
And then for Y2K, I was selected by Gary North to moderate a couple of his forums.
Really?
Yeah. So,
wow. Okay.
So Gary had me moderate a couple of forums, and I think there were like 20 different forums. And it was nothing fancy. It was I had no official title. I was just a volunteer moderator, but I got to dive in and got to pour some water on some flame wars. But it was a lot of fun, and that was a direct outgrowth of Usenet as well. A lot of people who were on mis.survivalism moved over to Gary North's Y2K forums. And by the way, those Y2K forums are actually all archived. And even now that Gary North has passed away, I think they're still available if you want to go back through any of those threads. And they were very interesting. Some of them, of course, were alarmist. But I think in part because there was so much interest from the internet on Y2K, it actually drove a lot of companies to actually mitigate and remediate the Y2K date rollover problems that they otherwise would have had. They poured millions of dollars into remediation for the 2-digit date problem that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it was one of those. They talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. In this case, it was a self-mitigating prophecy.
Sure. So where did you? That's another kind of one of my interests. I was 19, so I was a sophomore in university when I remember it happening. And I didn't quite grab the whole gravity of it at the time. But looking back on it, are you a firm believer in we dealt with the issue ahead of time, or are you in the other camp of it was a nothing burger and?
No, it was definitely had some considerable problems that could have been created, especially in the banking sector. There were a lot of old COBOL programmers who were pulled out of mothballs to go fix some of that code. And maybe they should have added one more digit to the date problem, because in the year 9999 they may have the same problem all over again.
That's good. What was Gary North's thoughts post Y2K? Do you know much at all of where he kind of landed after that?
I never met Gary face to face. We just corresponded. He was a very kindly man and a very godly man, of course. He also is one of the most generous people I have ever met. He put all of his books for the Institute for Christian Economics, ICE,
okay,
and his ICE books website. He turned his entire library of books, basically his entire life's work, into a free library that's still available now. Thankfully, a lot of that was endowed by one of his benefactors, but he had the foresight and the kindness and the generosity to make all those books available free, including all of his economics books. The one book that I think everyone should read that is absolutely timeless is his book, Christian Economics. But Gary was quite concerned about Y2K. He was one of the first folks to really ring the alarm bell on it. And he wasn't just an alarmist. He wanted to protect his own family. He moved his own family to a big farm, I think it was in Tennessee or Kentucky, that had natural gas wells, and he had everything set up for natural gas, heating his house, running generators, everything. All of his hot water was provided by natural gas, and it was all off of local wellhead pressure. There was no compressors involved at all, right from his own property. So he practiced what he preached, and again, he set up these white forums, and he got a lot of people squared away, and a lot of that preparedness carried people through all the way to things like Hurricane Katrina years later.
That's incredible. So we both, I think maybe before we started recording, chatted about how we both dug into the Usenet archives. And so the earliest post I could find of yours was February 7th, 1992 in rec.guns. And it was, let me see, I'm going to read it to you. It'll be fun. It was nothing. Anyway, it said, in the answer to your questions on 45 mags, there are only two types that I recommend. Original U.S. government issue. Usually they have a federal contract number, and the original Colt. And then you said the vast majority of aftermarket magazines are not worth buying. They have lousy quality control, and on it goes from there. Do you still feel that way? 30?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
And I didn't realize I had posted that early. I thought I started posting in the late 90s, because I mainly lurked in rec.guns and talk.politics.guns and miscellaneous.survivalism in the late 80s, early 90s. I didn't really start posting a lot until the late 90s, and that was more promotion for what originally was a shareware novel called Triple Aught, and later called the Gray 90s and Triple Aught, and that later was expanded to become my first full-length novel, which was called Patriots. That's why I got involved in actually posting on Usenet. Was more to promote those books. So yeah, it was fun. It was interesting. It was a very freewheeling exchange of ideas. If anyone thought that someone was trying to pull a fast one or was being self-promotional, they got shot down very quickly. So you had to be very careful what you posted. And there were notorious flame wars that developed in a lot of the Usenet forums. Some of the forums were way out there. I mean, they had, talks about everything, like even like sexual fetishes and fantasies and all that stuff. And that I stuck to the more practical forums, and I tried to just put in my 2 cents worth where I could share my knowledge. One of the other early posts I had was I helped co-author a foreign ammunition box translation page. It was an FAQ page, a frequently asked questions page, that went through Spanish, German, a bunch of different languages. I helped with the Spanish and German part, translating foreign ammo boxes. And then I was one of the folks that posted a chart of non-corrosive dates for U.S. military ammunition. I try to keep it practical for people. And then, of course, I was the main author of a FAQ on .31899 guns that just kind of kept growing, and it kind of became a standard reference for the internet. It still is.
It's funny because people, I guess, people kind of younger than myself just kind of take for granted that stuff's always been out there, but it all had to be developed from somewhere.
Yeah, somebody had to take the time to key it all in. That was the main thing. In those days, there was not, optical character reading.
Right.
Was very rudimentary at the time, and text to voice was also very, or voice to text was also very rudimentary in those days. In fact, voice to text really didn't exist until the 90s, really. So, or late 90s. So a lot of it was very laborious, keying all this stuff in by hand.
So I learned something putting together today's show. I always love looking at kind of where the genesis of a book comes from. And I've always known it as Patriots, but I discovered that it had multiple names, including the Gray 90s, which I'm going to guess was a play on the phrase the gay 90s, was it? Or was that not? Yes. Yeah, okay.
Play on that. And the main character's name is his family name is Gray.
Okay. I thought that was pretty ingenious. So, I'm a Stephen King fan. I have been for years. And I remember in 2000, he made a big deal out of putting out Riding the Bullet as an ebook. And they're like, oh, he's a groundbreaker. And I realized doing this, you were 5 years ahead of him with your Gray 90s. How did that shareware experiment come about?
I just kind of thought it up and did it. I saw what people were doing with software.
Okay.
And were putting some pretty useful little, they didn't even call them apps in those days, little applications out as shareware. And if someone liked them and used them, they were encouraged to just mail the guy a $5 bill. I thought, well, I've got this novel manuscript. I can't find an agent. I can't find a publisher. I'll just put it out as shareware. So I kind of came up with the idea. I had the first shareware novel. And because Usenet was such a small community in those days, and because there were very few free ebooks out there, there were people who had taken like old 19th century and earlier poetry and keyed it in and made it available. But I think I was one of the first people, or maybe the first, to put a whole full-length novel out as shareware. I put it up a chapter at a time originally, and then at the bottom of each chapter, I just put a little note that said, "Are you still reading? If so, please consider mailing me a $5 bill." I gave my address, and I didn't think much would happen with that. But in the long run, the popularity of that shareware novel ended up getting me an agent and getting me a publisher. And that's where everything took off from there. So I'm very thankful that people took the time to download my novel. They critiqued it mercilessly. If nothing else, they caught a lot of typos. In the long run, we ended up having 70,000 people download that novel.
Wow.
And this was in the early days of the internet. There really wasn't much of a public internet at all, except America Online had just kind of been created. And I ended up having my novel get downloaded so many times. In those days, that the data limits were really tight in terms of how much bandwidth you could use. So on FidoNet, it was kind of pushing the upper edge of the envelope in terms of what people could download. And, in those days, people were like logging in after 7 p.m. when the phone rates, and they were downloading this novel at 1200 baud.
Right.
to download each chapter of the novel would take about 10 minutes.
I don't know if you've ever said or if you even remember, but did very many people send you a $5 bill in the mail?
Yeah. In fact, I had people sending me money even after the paperback edition of Patriots was out. Even 3 or 4 years later, I was still getting $5 checks in the mail because pirated copies of, even though I had taken the novel down, pirated copies of my novel were still floating around with that address, and I was still getting checks in the mail from people, or $5 bills, or $5 Canadian bills. Yeah, that went on for quite a while. And one kind of funny aside, I also used to sell a lot of magazines and things at gun shows.
Oh.
And I would have copies of my book sitting there as well. And I would have people just walk up to me, recognize me, hand me a $5 bill, not say a word, and walk away. And the other dealers at the tables next to me were like, Jim, what's your secret? People just handing you money.
That's awesome.
I refer to that as guiltware because it was shareware, but with a delay, and people realized, oh yeah, I should have ponied up years ago, and they just would hand me a $5 bill.
So did you have your own website for that, or I might have missed that, or did you post that in one of the forums? I didn't even
have my own website originally. There was a guy by the name of Ammon Campbell who was nice enough to create the very first site. And then there were, I think, 6 different mirror sites on 3 different continents where people could download the book.
Wow.
And that was the original 28. The original manuscript was 19 chapters, then it was 27 chapters, and then eventually that grew into the 33 chapter version of Patriots.
I want to come back to the evolution of the book a little bit, but I just wanted you mentioned AOL, and if you couldn't tell by my accent, I'm a Canadian, so we didn't have, at least early on, I never had an experience with AOL. I worked at a local library and taught people how to use the internet, but AOL just wasn't a thing. But I found this post from 96, and it said, tonight, Wednesday, May 22nd, 96, from 10 till midnight, there'll be a live chat on survivalism with Jim Rawles on AOL keyword Periscope in the chat room, the grassy knoll. I thought that was really cool. Go ahead.
That chat was not audio. That was text. And I can remember that particular session because some of these guys must have been typing 200 words a minute. And here I was plodding along at 35 words per minute. And I think I was frustrating people because my responses were so slow. And people were flinging questions at me left and right. And I still remember that particular chat. And yeah, if you did back through Usenet, the other thing you'll see is an announcement for I had just done a speech in St. Louis, Missouri, the summer before, in the summer of 2000. In September of 2001, on September 13th, 2001, I was supposed to give a lecture at a local NRA meeting. They were going to fly me down to Southern California to give a speech on preparedness and firearms for preparedness. I had to cancel that speech because 9/11 attacks occurred and they grounded all the flights. But if you go back through Survivalism, you can see my announcement for that I made right around the 6th, the 7th of September, 2001, saying, yeah, I'll be there on the 13th of September. But that never happened.
The whole world changed, hey?
Yeah, it sure did. And I think the terror attacks of 2001 also, I think, were a good confirmation for survivors in terms of the vulnerability of the United States and its infrastructure.
So let's slide back just a little on the book, because of course I go through the Wayback Machine. Do you ever use that, the Internet Time Machine? Yeah. So I did some digging, and some of the earliest references for your book had a copyright of 1990. Was that right, or was that a misprint? Is that when you first started?
No, that was I wrote that book the winter of 1990, 1991, as I was pounding nails building my first house in Idaho, near Orofino, Idaho. So I went ahead and copyrighted it in 1990.
That makes sense.
So and it first went out as shareware in late 1991 or early 1992.
And then, so how long did it take you to release? Did you have the whole thing written when you were releasing chapter by chapter, or did you?
Oh, yeah, I had written the first 19 chapters when I first started releasing chapters.
Okay.
And then it got up to 27 chapters, I think, by the time it all went out on Usenet. And then a Christian publisher in Lafayette, Louisiana, named Huntington House, noticed the success of that shareware novel, and they said they wanted to do a paperback version. And by then, I had expanded it to 32 or 33 chapters, and they picked up in paperback. And then officially, that was in 1998, I took down the shareware version, although, again, copies are still floating around.
I was going to say, nothing ever really comes down off the internet, does it?
No, in fact, well, you mentioned Wayback Machine. All your listeners should be aware that in the age of the internet, everything you say, every email you send, even every site that you visit is recorded somewhere. It's there for posterity or for legal purposes. So be careful, folks.
Ain't that the truth? And not good, but so I don't think any of the AOL chat. I don't think any of them have been archived anywhere, have they, that we know of? Or
no, I think Usenet, because it was a bunch of geeks, actually got archived better than AOL did, because AOL was more user level, whereas Usenet, a lot of these guys were professional programmers.
Right.
There were not that many people on Usenet. It was a very small community when you come right down to it. There was maybe, 300,000 or 400,000 people that were regular users. And the fact that I had 70,000 people download my manuscript tells you, not that my manuscript was great. It just was novel. It was truly novel because nobody else had put a novel out there. So I think it just kind of piqued people's curiosity. It was a very small community.
So we have a what we call the post-apocalyptic book club here at the workshop. we work our way through different books, and I mean there's a ton out there now. But you were kind of the first prepper fiction. What were your influences?
I got to stop you right there.
Sorry,
because I was not the first prepper fiction. The first prepper fiction was written by a guy who's passed away. His name was Jerry Ahern, and he wrote a book series called The Survivalist.
Right.
And eventually he wrote like 40 plus books, and they actually became kind of derivative and repetitious. But he was the guy who really came up with the idea. And what I wrote, in a way, was sort of an homage to Jerry Ahern. So I don't take credit at all for being the first prepper or survivalist novelist. That had been done before quite successfully in the paperback genre. I was just the first one to do it as a shareware novel.
Did you ever were there any other influences other than Jerry Ahern on you? For you?
I think Jerry Pournelle.
Right.
And Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven wrote the book Lucifer's Hammer, which is an absolute
so good
survivalist classic. And I think that was actually more of a motivator for me even than Jerry Ahern. And I had the privilege of corresponding back and forth with Jerry Pournelle before he passed away. He was one of the writers for Mel Tappan's P.S. letter.
I caught that.
Yeah. And you'll notice that in the biography notes that I put up at the top of my blog, like I just had one for Reginald Bretner last week. Okay. He was a science fiction writer who also lived in southwestern Oregon, just like Mel Tappan. Mel Tappan kind of tapped into the writing community of southwestern Oregon, and he had several different science fiction writers like Dean Ing and Reginald Bretner who wrote articles for his Preparedness newsletter. It was called PS Letter. It was only published for 3 years. I actually found a hard copy set of it on eBay about 20 years ago. An original set, not photocopies, and the original yellow, pink, and blue paper. They had each year they changed the paper stock they printed it on. I still have a binder set of that. But Mel Tappan, boy, he was an amazing guy. He really motivated a lot of people, and he tapped into a real brain trust of folks who helped him write this newsletter. And again, it was called PS Letter. I think it's originally was supposed to stand for Personal Survival Letter, but because it had a lot of economics and had a lot on vehicles, they just left it as PS Letter because he wanted to have a broad audience. And then after he passed away, that newsletter was carried on for a couple more years under a different title by a fascinating guy by the name of Carl Hess, who also lived in southwestern Oregon. Carl Hess was more of a political wonk. He was actually a speechwriter for the Nixon administration, who later became a radical libertarian, in fact, a quasi-socialist libertarian.
Wow.
Carl Hess ended up taking over the PS Letter because Nancy Tappan, his wife, didn't want to carry on with it. So that newsletter, I think, as well as the columns that Mel Tappan wrote for Guns and Ammo magazine, and he also wrote one for Soldier of Fortune magazine. He wrote columns. I think those were some of the most influential writers in creating those writings were the most influential in creating what we now know as the modern preparedness or survivalist, or now they say prepper movement.
The permanent bug out location was or I get the concept of living at your bug out location.
Yeah, that was Mel Tappan, big time.
He was I remember coming across a lot of his old Soldier of Fortune articles on, I think, BitTorrent, maybe many years ago, maybe 2003, 2005, and I was blown away. And I picked up Mel Tappan on guns recently, and I think is that
everyone should have a copy of both Tappan on Survival and Survival Guns.
Right.
They're just monumental books, and we really the whole community owes a debt of gratitude to him, and also for just his common sense. You know, he was not some wild-eyed lunatic. He was not. I guess I shouldn't use wild-eyed lunatic and Kurt Saxon in the same sentence because he's still alive. I hear he's living in a rest home somewhere in Arkansas, but he wasn't really radical like Kurt Saxon was. Mel Tappan was very down to earth. He was an investment banker kind of guy by training, but he had real common sense, and that really carried through all of his writings.
I've been trying to find as many of the kind of the original, I call it not artifacts, but modern pieces of history. And I go around and speak at a lot of different prepping events, and I kind of want to have this weird vision of kind of having this little traveling prepper museum, just a table of artifacts people can come and look at and read through the old books, and it's fun. I don't know, it's because it's funny because we can touch any piece of information we ever want, but we also are very, very short-minded and have short memories nowadays, where we forget all of the people that built the steps we're standing on. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You could go all the way back to the nuclear war, the fallout shelter era, with writers like Pat Frank, who wrote Alas Babylon.
Yes.
Or there's so many.
On the Beach?
Yeah, On the Beach by Neville Shute. There's also a book by a Frenchman named René Barjavel, who wrote a book called Ashes, Ashes.
Oh.
That was quite good. Gordon Dixon, another science fiction writer who wrote a novel called Wolf and Iron. I think that's also very influential as well. Folks should get copies of these and think about, where the starting point that these authors came from. A lot of this was original concepts that they generated. I look at a lot of what I wrote as standing on the shoulders of those original writers. I don't take a lot of credit myself. Those writers really deserve all the credit.
I appreciate that. And it's absolutely true, because what do they say? There's nothing new under the sun, and we reframe things to our generation and do the best we can, I think. Absolutely. So I don't want to keep you longer than the hour that I promised you, and I could pick your brain on this for a long time, but I've got 4 or 5 questions from the community.
Sure.
Are you cool for kind of a, yep. Okay.
Before you do that, if anybody wants to dig into Usenet,
yes,
there's a site called groups.google.com. And between that and Wayback Machine, you can kind of piece together a very large portion of what went on in Usenet.
It's really interesting. The search functionality leaves a little to be desired, but I have discovered you can put in the word before, colon, and then your year, month, and date separated by dashes, and it will allow you to kind of eliminate a lot of the new stuff.
Yeah.
So that helps. And it's good to have out there, because who knows how long that stuff will be there. Google will just be like, we don't need it anymore, and it'll be gone,
Yep.
But okay, what do we got here? So Dave on YouTube, he said, with the proliferation of new media sources, what are some of the most factual, regardless of political bent, that you would follow today? Or are there any?
Well, in terms of fiction, I consciously avoid reading other survival fiction because I don't want to subconsciously echo them in my own writings.
Sure.
I read a lot of survivalist fiction. But in terms of nonfiction, oh boy, there's so many books out there. It's really hard to quantify them. Like David Nash's book, Basic Survival, for example, is a really good starting point. Anything written by Matt Stein, and unfortunately Matt has passed away. He wrote the book called When Disaster Strikes. And he also wrote a book called When Technology Fails.
Okay.
And he actually wrote a few pieces for my blog before he passed away. His stuff is amazing, quite perspicacious.
Wonderful.
So many books that are more detailed, like economics books. I would go back to a book from 40 years ago now. That was The Alpha Strategy by John Pugsley.
Okay.
He was the first one who really recommended investing in tangibles, and not just barterable tangibles, but tangibles you could eat. So The Alpha Strategy, and that book is available as a free ebook now as well. But there's so many great books out there. In the food storage arena, you've got books like Passport to Survival or Making the Best of Basics. A lot of these books, by the way, are on my bookshelf page at survivalblog.com. And if you just go through my list there, I think you'll find a lot of really, really useful books. In the medical arena, anything written by Nurse Amy and Dr. Alton.
Yes.
They're just fantastic stuff. A lot of the early stuff written by Patriot Nurse, for example, is she was originally more of a writer than she was a video commentator. And a lot of her original courseware is just absolutely chock full of useful tidbits for people in the medical area. So, and I could go on and on and on. There's books on do-it-yourself communications, and for example, in my blog I just had a couple of different articles about digital communications over HF ham radio.
Oh, wow.
There's so much knowledge out there, and that's one of the great things about Survival Blog. The knowledge base that exists goes far, far beyond my own knowledge. I feel so much gratitude to people who've shared their knowledge over the years. Early on, I started running out of things of my own to post on my blog, so I came up with the idea of doing a writing contest. And then I had a lot of the advertisers on my site offer free merchandise or free courses for the people that were doing training courses as prizes for that writing contest. And now we're up to, I run it in bi-monthly rounds, we're up to round 108 of the writing contest. But so many of those articles have such a tremendous depth of detail and knowledge that goes far, far beyond my own. I really feel deep gratitude to all those writers. And I put all of the archives for Survival Blog available free. There's no members only area. It's all freely searchable. You can go back all the way back to 2005. And I posted almost daily. I've only a few days since 2005, right after my first wife passed.
Oh, did we lose you, Jim?
There's over 32,000 articles and columns that are archived there. It's all free for the taking. And for any of your listeners that are even mildly interested in preparedness, I suggest you dig in, but just don't start at 10 o'clock at night because you'll be up until 2 or 3 in the morning. There's a lot in those archives to dig through.
I got one more. So Scott from Instagram wants to know, do you have any new books in the works?
Yeah, I have my Land of Promise series is on hold because things change so rapidly with ISIS. Right after I published the first volume, I'm waiting for ISIS to pop up again. I think they will. And when they do, I have 2 more manuscripts that are mostly written that I'll just have to bring up to date with current events. And I'm also working on a couple of anthologies out of the blog. One of the nice things about having the blog and its deep archives is I've got enough material. I could just do one whole book of just quotes. I could do a whole book of just recipes. There's so much that's in those blog archives. I'll be anthologizing out of that blog probably for the next 5 or 10 years. And I never really intend to retire. I'll keep writing until I drop.
I like hearing that. I mean, not that we expect you to drop anytime soon, but I love hearing people who do what they love and just want to keep doing it.
I certainly do. I really feel blessed, and it's such a great community of people. I get emails every day from folks, and the most gratifying ones are the folks that are now self-employed living in the boonies who really never even considered it until I suggested it 15, 20 years ago. And it's great to see so many people have made a lifestyle change out of this.
I appreciate you taking the time, Jim. This was fun. The hour flew like nobody's business. And if you're ever up for it again down the road, I would totally love to have you back on in a few months.
I would love to have you. I would love to be back on if you'll have me.
How can people, I know you've mentioned it, but again, how do people follow up with you? How can they support you, that sort of thing?
Sure. Again, I'm the editor of survivalblog.com. It's just the way it sounds, all slammed together, survivalblog.com. And again, it's a free site. All the archives are freely available. Please, folks, dive in. And print out the most important articles because you want to have a offline EMP-proof version. I do produce an archive stick every year from the blog that adds a year of blog posts and a whole bunch of bonus books. It's a waterproof USB stick that we produce each year. But you could essentially create your own archive just by downloading articles and building your own database.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. I'm gonna hit the stop recording button here yet. Just don't hang up on me quite yet.